Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live beneath an endless sky where the horizon stretches so far that storms announce themselves hours before they arrive? What would it feel like to call home a place where the wind itself could reshape your world in minutes? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when whole nations lived under the vast, trembling skies of the Great Plains, where survival meant reading the subtle language of clouds and learning to dance with forces far greater than any single person. We'll walk quietly through a world where tornadoes weren't just weather events, but part of the very rhythm of existence. Before we begin this gentle journey together, I need a small favor. If you're ready to step back in time with me tonight, tap that like button. And don't forget to subscribe. You'll never miss our late-night journeys into history's forgotten corners. Drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? Maybe some of you are settling in late in the United States, others are just beginning their day in Europe, or perhaps you're tuning in from somewhere halfway across the world. I love seeing how far this quiet circle of time travelers can reach. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're about to discover how human beings survived not just the storms themselves, but the endless waiting between them. Imagine yourself awakening on a buffalo hide bedroll, the rough texture familiar against your cheek. Above you, through the smoke hole at the peak of your teepee, the sky shows that peculiar grey of early dawn, not quite night, not quite morning. The air carries that particular chill that settles just before sunrise on the Great Plains, and you can hear the soft murmur of your family beginning to stir around you. You are young, perhaps 15 summers, a member of a Lakota band camped near a river bend where the buffalo have been grazing. Your people move with the herds, and the herds move with the grass, and the grass moves with the seasons. But more than any of these, you move with the sky. This is the 1840s, and the world above you is your calendar, your compass, your constant companion. As you roll from your sleeping place, your bare feet touch the packed earth floor of the teepee, still holding yesterday's warmth from the central fire. The smell surrounds you immediately. Wood smoke mingled with the earthy scent of buffalo hide, the faint sweetness of dried grass, and something else, something metallic and distant that makes you pause. Your grandmother, already awake and tending the coals, catches your expression. "You smell it too," she says softly, not quite a question. She doesn't need to explain. You've learned to taste the air the way others learn to read tracks in mud. That metallic tang means weather is building somewhere beyond the horizon. You step outside and the world spreads before you in all directions, an ocean of grass that moves like water in the constant wind. The sky here doesn't just arch overhead, it dominates everything, consuming 3/4 of your vision no matter which way you turn. To live here is to live always in relationship with that sky, always watching, always listening. The morning tasks begin with the same rhythm they've followed all your life. You walk to the river's edge, perhaps 200 paces from camp, carrying a buffalo paunch converted to a water container. The grass whispers against your legs, tall prairie grass that reaches your waist, each blade carrying dew that will soak through your leggings before you reach the water. But even this simple task of fetching water requires constant awareness. As you kneel by the stream filling the container, your eyes sweep the horizon automatically. You've been taught since childhood to watch for the telltale signs, the way clouds stack themselves into towers, the subtle shift in wind direction, the quality of light that changes when pressure begins to drop. This morning, you notice the birds. The meadowlarks that usually call from every compass point have fallen quiet. A few crows pass overhead, flying lower than usual, their wings working harder against air that seems somehow thicker. These are small things easy to miss if you haven't been trained to notice them. But for you, they're as obvious as words written across the sky. Walking back to camp, the water container heavy in your arms, you feel that familiar weight of responsibility that comes with living so exposed. Your band, perhaps 40 people, depends on the collective ability to read these signs. There are no basements here, no solid houses to retreat into when the sky turns violent. There's only knowledge passed down through generations of people who survived by paying attention. Your family's teepee sits among the others in a loose circle, each one positioned with careful consideration of drainage, wind patterns, and escape routes. The poles, long lodgepole pines carried from the distant mountains, are anchored deep into the prairie soil and lashed with sinew that your mother and aunts have chewed to exactly the right suppleness. Even so, you know that all of this, your home, your belongings, your shelter, could be scattered across the plains in minutes if the sky chooses violence. As the morning progresses, you help with the endless small tasks that keep life moving. You check the horses, 30 or so animals grazing near camp under the watchful eye of your younger brother. The horses are wealth, transportation, and early warning system all in one. Their ears and nostrils can detect pressure changes long before human senses notice them. When horses grow restless for no visible reason, experienced people start preparing for weather. Today the horses seem calm enough, but you notice how they're positioned, all facing the same direction into the wind that's been building steadily since sunrise. This is normal, but you file the observation away. Nothing about plains weather is ever ignored. Your aunt calls you to help with repairing a section of teepee cover where the wind loosened the sinew binding. This is constant work, the maintenance of shelter that must be portable, durable, and repairable with materials you can carry. As you work, she tells you again the stories you've heard since childhood about reading the sky. When the clouds start to turn green, she says, pulling the buffalo hide taut, that's when you run for the creek bed. When the air goes completely still after being windy, that's when you gather the children and move fast. When the wind starts turning in circles... She doesn't finish the sentence. She doesn't need to. You know about the circles. Everyone knows about the circles. The afternoon brings the kind of heat that builds into something bigger. The sun beats down from a sky that's begun to stack itself into towering columns of cloud far to the west. They're still distant, maybe half a day's ride, but they're building with the slow, ominous patience of forces much larger than anything human. As you work, helping to dry buffalo meat, mending moccasins, gathering dried grass for kindling, part of your attention remains always on that western horizon. This divided attention is the rhythm of your life, present for immediate tasks but constantly monitoring the larger patterns that could change everything in moments. The air grows heavier as the day progresses. That metallic taste becomes stronger, and you notice how sounds seem to carry differently. Voices from the far side of camp sound both sharper and more distant than usual. Your grandmother emerges from her teepee and stands for a long moment, simply watching the western sky. When she catches your eye, she nods slightly. Preparation time. This isn't panic. There's nothing panicked about people who have lived this way for generations. It's more like a choreographed dance that everyone knows by heart. Loose items get secured, water containers get topped off, the horses are moved closer, children are quietly told to stay near their mothers. Everything valuable that can be quickly gathered is set within easy reach. But preparation can only go so far. As evening approaches and those western clouds continue to build, you're reminded again of the central truth of plains life. You are small and the sky is vast, and survival depends not on controlling the weather, but on bending with it. The wind picks up as the sun begins to set, and with it comes the sound that people here know so well. The voice of the grass itself, millions of blades rustling together in a rhythm that rises and falls like breathing. It's a sound that can be comforting or ominous, depending on what else you're hearing beneath it. Tonight, beneath the grass song, there's something else, a low rumble, so distant and faint that you feel it more than hear it. Thunder, still many miles away, but moving closer with the patience of something that knows it doesn't need to hurry. As darkness approaches, families gather around their fires for the evening meal. The conversations are quieter than usual, but not worried, just attentive. Children are kept closer. Stories told tonight are shorter, interrupted more frequently by glances toward the western horizon where lightning has begun to flicker, still too far away to hear its thunder. You help bank the fire carefully, ensuring coals will remain alive but that no sparks will escape to the dry grass around camp. Water is set aside in easily accessible containers. Your family's most precious possessions, spiritual items, family tokens, essential tools, are gathered into bundles that can be carried quickly if needed. As you prepare for sleep, rolling out your buffalo hide bedding, the air itself seems to be holding its breath. The usual night sounds, crickets, nightbirds, the distant yipping of coyotes, are muted, as if the approaching weather has created a bubble of silence around your world. Lying on your back, looking up through the smoke hole at a sky now flickering with distant lightning, you feel the peculiar combination of vulnerability and preparedness that defines life on the Great Plains. You are utterly exposed to forces beyond human control, yet surrounded by generations of accumulated wisdom about how to survive those forces. The thunder is closer now, no longer just a feeling, but an actual sound rolling across the vastness. Still distant, but steady in its approach. You close your eyes and listen to it mixing with the wind song in the grass, the soft breathing of your family, the subtle creaking of teepee poles adjusting to the increasing wind pressure. This is your world, a place where storms announce themselves hours in advance, where survival depends on collective attention to details most people never notice, where home is something that can be taken down and moved in less than an hour. It's a world of constant small preparations for events that might never come, but sometimes do. As sleep begins to take you, the thunder rolls closer, and you drift off to the ancient lullaby of the plains. Wind in grass, thunder in the distance, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your people have survived this sky for countless generations before you. Tomorrow, there may be cleanup. Tonight, there is only the rhythm of preparation and the vast electric sky holding its breath above the endless grass. As the thunder fades into memory and we drift deeper into this quiet historical journey, let us turn our attention to one particular life, a story that unfolds slowly, like the approach of weather itself across the endless plains. It is a tale that speaks to the profound relationship between human consciousness and the vast atmospheric forces that shape our world, a relationship built on careful observation, intuitive understanding, and the weight of responsibility that comes with knowledge that can save lives. Her name was Whirlwind Woman, though she hadn't always carried that name. Like many of her people, she had been given different names as she grew and changed, each one marking a new understanding of who she was becoming. Born around 1820 to a Pawnee band that moved with the seasons between the Platte and Republican Rivers, she had been called Small Hawk as a child for her habit of scanning the sky with fierce attention even when very young. The world into which Small Hawk was born was one of constant movement and adaptation. The Pawnee lived in a landscape that demanded both stability and flexibility, their substantial earth lodges providing shelter and community during the harsh winters, while their seasonal migrations followed the rhythms of buffalo herds and agricultural cycles. It was a world where survival depended not just on individual strength or courage, but on the accumulated wisdom of generations, passed down through stories, ceremonies, and the careful teaching of essential skills. The gift, if you could call it that, had shown itself early. While other children played games in the dirt around their earth lodges, Small Hawk would stand motionless for long periods, head tilted back, watching clouds form and reform in patterns that seemed to speak to her in ways she couldn't yet explain. Her parents first noticed this behavior when she was barely 3 years old, standing outside their lodge for hours at a time, seemingly oblivious to the normal activities of village life as she tracked the movement of clouds across the vast dome of prairie sky. Her grandmother, already in her 70s and wise in the ways of weather signs, noticed this unusual focus and began to teach the child what she herself had learned across decades of Great Plains summers. This grandmother, known as Watches the Wind, had been her own band's primary weather reader for nearly 50 years, and she recognized in her granddaughter's intense sky-watching something that went beyond ordinary childhood curiosity. "The sky has moods," her grandmother would say, settling beside the girl on the packed earth outside their lodge. "Like people, but bigger, much bigger. And like people, if you watch long enough, you learn to read what's coming." She would point to subtle variations in cloud color, the way shadows moved across the grass, the behavior of birds and insects that most people never noticed. "Everything is connected," she would explain. "The ants know when rain is coming 3 days before it arrives. The hawks can feel pressure changes that tell them when wind will shift. You must learn to see with their eyes, feel with their bodies." The lessons began simply. Cloud shapes and their meanings, the difference between the innocent white puffs that brought gentle rain and the towering anvil heads that warned of violent storms. The way wind shifted before pressure changes, moving in circles that told experienced watchers which direction a storm was traveling and how strong it might become, how birds behaved when storms were still a day away, the way they would cluster in certain trees or fly in patterns that revealed the invisible pressure waves moving through the atmosphere ahead of visible weather. But Small Hawk absorbed these teachings with an intensity that surprised even her patient teacher. By her 6th summer, she was spending entire days outside, learning to feel barometric pressure changes in her own body, discovering that certain clouds, visible only as tiny specks on the horizon, could tell her what weather would arrive 3 days later. By her 10th summer, she could predict rain with accuracy that made other families in the band start paying attention to her quiet observations. The Pawnee, unlike their nomadic neighbors, lived in substantial earth lodges for much of the year, rounded structures of logs and sod that could withstand considerable wind and weather. These lodges were marvels of engineering adapted to the harsh realities of plains life, with thick walls that provided insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, and low profiles that could deflect even strong winds. But they too were vulnerable to the violent storms that swept the plains with terrifying regularity, and they too depended on individuals with the gift of reading the sky's intentions. As Small Hawk grew into her teenage years, her reputation grew with her. She would wake before dawn and climb to the highest point near their village, often the roof of the ceremonial lodge, and stand there in the half-light, watching the eastern horizon for signs of what the day might bring. These early morning vigils became a sacred ritual, a communion between human consciousness and the vast atmospheric forces that ruled their world. She learned to read the subtle color variations in pre-dawn light that revealed moisture levels in the air, to feel the minute temperature variations that warned of frontal systems still hundreds of miles away. Other members of the band began timing their hunting trips, their gathering expeditions, their travel plans around her quiet pronouncements. Her predictions were delivered without fanfare or dramatic gestures, simply calm observations shared with anyone who asked. 2 days of good weather, then wind from the northwest, she might say, and families would hurry to complete their outdoor tasks. "Storm from the southwest, but it will pass around us. The pressure is moving wrong for it to hit here," she might observe, and people would secure their belongings but remain calm. Her predictions carried the weight of consistent accuracy, earned through years of patient observation and an intuitive understanding of atmospheric patterns that she could feel as much as see. The responsibility was enormous, though she rarely spoke of it. When families decided whether to send hunting parties out for multi-day trips, when the band's leaders planned important ceremonies or seasonal moves, when individuals made choices that could affect their safety and survival, all of these decisions increasingly relied on her ability to read signs in the sky that others couldn't see. She carried this weight with characteristic quiet dignity, but it shaped every aspect of her daily life. But the sky that gave Small Hawk her gift also demanded its price. It was during her 17th summer that the storm came that would change her name forever. The day had begun with unusual stillness, the kind of breathless quiet that experienced plains dwellers knew to fear. The air hung heavy and yellow-tinged, as if the sun were shining through old glass. Birds that should have been singing at dawn remained silent in the cottonwood trees along the creek. Even the insects seemed subdued, moving sluggishly through air that felt thick and oppressive. Small Hawk had risen early, as was her custom, and climbed to her watching place. What she saw gathering on the western horizon made her stomach clench with a fear she had never experienced before. Clouds were building in a pattern she had seen only in the worst dreams shared by the old weather readers, towering columns of black and green that seemed to reach from the earth clear up to the spirit world above. The clouds moved with an ominous rotation, and she could see lightning flickering constantly within them, though they were still too distant for thunder to reach the village. But it was more than just what she could see that terrified her. The air itself felt wrong, charged with a malevolent energy that made her skin prickle and her hair stand on end. The pressure was dropping so rapidly that she could feel it in her bones, a sensation like being slowly crushed by invisible hands. This was beyond anything her grandmother had taught her, beyond the normal range of dangerous weather that even experienced storm watchers knew how to handle. She had run to wake the village leaders, her feet barely touching the ground as she raced between the lodges. "Everyone must move," she gasped to the band chief, a man who had trusted her predictions for years and had never seen her display such urgent alarm. "Not just prepare, move, now, to the creek bottoms as far as we can go. This storm will destroy everything here." The chief, whose name was Standing Bear, looked at the still distant clouds and then back at the young woman whose weather predictions had never led them astray. Her face was pale with terror, her hands shaking as she pointed toward the approaching wall of darkness. In all the years he had known her, through storms that had tested the courage of experienced warriors, he had never seen her show such fear. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Not long enough," she replied. "Maybe 2 hours, maybe less. We need to get everyone to the deep part of Rock Creek, where the banks are highest. And we need to leave now." The urgency in her voice, so different from her usual calm observations, galvanized the entire village. Standing, Bear began shouting orders, sending runners to wake families still sleeping, organizing the rapid evacuation of nearly 200 people. Within an hour, faster than anyone thought possible, the entire band had gathered their most essential belongings and were making their way to the deepest part of the creek bed, a natural depression lined with willows and cottonwoods about a mile from their permanent lodges. The evacuation was a masterpiece of organized chaos. Families grabbed only what they could carry: children, elderly relatives, essential tools, sacred objects. Horses and dogs were herded along, adding their own anxiety to the growing sense of impending disaster. Small Hawk moved through the fleeing crowd like a ghost, constantly checking the approaching storm, calculating time and distance with growing desperation. They huddled there as the sky darkened to an unnatural green-black, and the wind began to move in ways that defied explanation. First it would blow from one direction, then suddenly shift and blow from another, as if the air itself had become confused and angry. Children were held close to their mothers' bodies. The elderly were positioned in the center of the group, protected by the bodies of the younger adults. Warriors who had faced enemy raiders and charging buffalo without flinching now pressed themselves against the earth, recognizing a force beyond any human ability to fight or flee from. Small Hawk crouched near the creek bank with her grandmother, both women watching the approaching storm with the intensity of their shared calling. Watch as the wind, despite her 70 years of reading weather signs, had never seen anything like what was moving toward them. "You were right to make us move," she whispered to her granddaughter. "This storm carries death with it." And then it came. Small Hawk, pressed against the creek bank with 30 other people, heard it before she saw it, a sound unlike any thunder or wind she had ever experienced. It began as a low roar, like buffalo stampeding, but it grew and grew until it filled not just her ears but her entire body, vibrating through the earth beneath her, making her bones hum with its power. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the earth below, from the sky above, from inside her own chest. The wind that preceded the tornado was unlike anything anyone had experienced. It didn't blow steadily from one direction, but seemed to attack from all sides simultaneously, creating whirlwinds within whirlwinds, lifting objects and hurling them in impossible directions. Dust and debris filled the air so thickly that people could barely see their own hands, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that breath began to fog despite the summer heat just minutes before. When she finally dared to raise her head above the creek bank, she saw something that would visit her dreams for the rest of her life. A column of spinning air, dark as night and wide as a village, was moving across the landscape where their lodges had stood just hours before. It moved with purpose, like a living thing, destroying everything it touched and hurling pieces of their former life high into the air. Lodgepoles, pottery, buffalo hides, corn-grinding stones, all spinning in the terrible dance of the whirlwind. The tornado seemed to possess its own malevolent intelligence, pausing to completely demolish certain structures while leaving others mysteriously untouched. She watched in horrified fascination as it lifted an entire earth lodge, tons of logs, sod and earth, and spun it like a child's toy before hurling the pieces across the prairie. The sound was indescribable, a combination of roaring wind, crashing timber, and something else, a high, keening note that seemed to come from the tornado itself, like the voice of some ancient, angry spirit. The tornado passed in minutes, but it left behind a silence so complete that Small Hawk wondered if she had gone deaf. No birds, no insects, no wind at all. Just the sound of people breathing and the occasional sob from someone who had lost something irreplaceable in those few minutes of destruction. The air smelled of wet earth and destruction, with an odd metallic tang that she would later learn to associate with the aftermath of violent storms. When they finally emerged from the creek bed and walked back to where their village had stood, they found almost nothing. The substantial earth lodges that had housed families for generations were gone, reduced to scattered mounds of mud and broken timbers. The ceremonial lodge where Small Hawk had climbed to watch the sky was completely erased, as if it had never existed at all. Even the layout of the village, the familiar paths between lodges, the communal areas where children played, had been obliterated, leaving only raw scars in the earth to mark where human lives had been lived for decades. But everyone lived. Every single person, from the oldest grandmother to the newest baby, had survived because one young woman had read the signs correctly and insisted that they act on what she saw coming. As the reality of this miracle began to sink in, people began to look at Small Hawk with a new kind of respect, tinged with something approaching awe. That night, as the band camped in the open, under a sky that had returned to its normal blue-black, the chief approached Small Hawk where she sat alone, still staring westward to where the storm had disappeared into darkness. She sat wrapped in a buffalo robe that someone had saved from the destruction, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the small fire that had been built for warmth and comfort. "You saved us all," he said simply, settling beside her on the still damp ground. "What name should we call you now?" "You." She was quiet for a long time, watching stars appear in a sky that had been so violent just hours before. The stars seemed impossibly bright after the day's darkness, and she found herself searching their familiar patterns for some sign of meaning, some explanation for the terrible power she had witnessed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new weight that hadn't been there before the storm. "Whirlwind woman," she said, "I have seen the sky's true power, and I will spend my life learning to understand it better." She did. Over the following years, as the band rebuilt their village and their lives, Whirlwind Woman became something more than just a weather predictor. She became a keeper of sky knowledge, someone who taught others not just what to watch for, but how to feel the subtle changes that preceded dangerous weather. She developed a complex system of signals that could alert the entire band to different levels of threat, from simple rain to the kind of violent storms that could reshape the landscape in minutes. Her teaching methods were as patient and thorough as her grandmother's had been, but informed by her own traumatic encounter with nature's ultimate violence. She taught her students to read not just the obvious signs, dark clouds, changing winds, but the subtle atmospheric pressures that preceded dangerous weather by hours or even days. She showed them how to feel barometric changes in their own bodies, how to interpret the behavior of animals and birds, how to read the thousands small signs that nature provided for those who knew how to look. Her reputation spread far beyond her own people. Traders passing through the region would seek her out for weather advice before continuing their journeys across the dangerous expanses of prairie where being caught in the wrong place by a severe storm could mean death. Other bands would send messengers to ask her opinion before scheduling important ceremonies or hunts, recognizing that her predictions carried an accuracy that could mean the difference between success and disaster. She became a living bridge between human communities and the vast, unpredictable forces that ruled the Great Plains sky. Her lodge became a place of pilgrimage for other weather readers who would travel hundreds of miles to share knowledge and learn from the woman who had predicted the great tornado that destroyed a village while saving every life. These gatherings became informal conferences where the accumulated weather wisdom of dozens of plains tribes was shared, compared, and refined. But perhaps most importantly, she trained others in her gift. Recognizing that no single person could carry such responsibility alone, and that her own mortality meant her knowledge could be lost, Whirlwind Woman identified young people in her band and neighboring communities who showed the same intuitive connection to atmospheric patterns that had marked her own childhood. She taught them not just the technical aspects of weather prediction, but the deeper responsibility that came with such knowledge, the weight of other people's lives depending on the accuracy of your observations. Her training methods were rigorous and demanding. Students would spend months learning to recognize subtle cloud formations, to feel pressure changes in their bodies, to read the behavior of birds and animals as indicators of approaching weather systems. But beyond the technical knowledge, she taught them about the spiritual and emotional dimensions of their calling. When people depend on your predictions for their safety, she would tell them, you carry their lives in your observations. You must be absolutely certain before you speak, but you must not hesitate when certainty comes. The years passed, and Whirlwind Woman grew from a young woman into a respected elder, her hair graying and her face marked by decades of squinting at horizons and sky signs. The world around her was changing too, white settlements pushing further west, buffalo herds growing smaller, new pressures and new uncertainties entering the lives of plains peoples. Treaties were made and broken, traditional hunting grounds were claimed by strangers, and the old ways of life that had sustained her people for generations were under constant threat. But the sky remained constant in its patterns, and her ability to read those patterns remained one of the few sources of predictable safety in an increasingly unpredictable world. As the pressures of a changing world mounted around them, her weather predictions became even more crucial. Hunting trips that once might have been delayed for better conditions now had to be undertaken when opportunities arose, regardless of weather. Her ability to find windows of safe weather in increasingly constrained circumstances became essential to her people's survival. She never forgot that terrible day when she had watched a tornado destroy her childhood home. The memory remained vivid throughout her life, not as trauma, but as teaching. It had shown her both the ultimate power of the natural forces her people lived with every day, and the crucial importance of the skills she carried. One moment of inattention, one misread sign, and everything could be lost in minutes. This awareness informed every prediction she made, every lesson she taught, every moment she spent scanning the endless sky for signs of danger. In her later years, when arthritis made it difficult to climb to high watching places, Whirlwind Woman would sit outside her lodge in the early morning hours, teaching the next generation of sky readers while feeling the air pressure changes in her bones. Her students would gather around her as she shared not just the technical knowledge of weather prediction, but the stories that carried the deeper wisdom, tales of storms survived, lessons learned from mistakes, the patient discipline required to read signs that might save lives. "The sky doesn't hate us," she would tell them, her voice still strong despite her advancing years. "But it doesn't love us either. It simply is, like the grass, like the buffalo, like the seasons themselves. Our job is not to control it, but to understand it well enough to live with it safely." These teaching sessions became legendary, drawing students from tribes across the Great Plains who would travel great distances to learn from the woman who had stared into the face of nature's ultimate violence and lived to teach others how to survive it. She also spoke to them about the changing world they all faced. "The old ways are being challenged," she would say, "but the sky remains the same. Storms do not care about treaties or boundaries or the color of a person's skin. Weather wisdom will be needed as long as people live under the open sky." She encouraged her students to share their knowledge with anyone who would listen, regardless of their tribe or background, understanding that survival knowledge was too precious to be hoarded. She died peacefully one autumn morning in 1889 at the age of nearly 70, an impressive lifespan for anyone in that time and place, but especially for someone whose life had been spent in such intimate relationship with the dangerous forces of plains weather. They found her outside her lodge, wrapped in her buffalo robe, facing west toward the horizon she had watched faithfully for more than 6 decades. Her weathered hands still held the small carved bone that she used to point out cloud formations to her students, and her face wore an expression of peaceful attention, as if she had been reading the sky right up until her final moment. The morning sky was clear and calm, they said, a gentle day, perfect for traveling to the spirit world. Even after her death, Whirlwind Woman's influence continued to spread like ripples on a pond. The students she had trained became teachers themselves, passing along not just her weather reading techniques, but her deeper understanding of what it meant to live responsibly under such a vast and powerful sky. Her name became part of the stories told around winter fires, not as legend, but as example of how human attention and wisdom could create safety even in the most exposed and vulnerable circumstances. Her legacy lived on in the survival of countless people who never knew her name, but whose lives were saved by weather predictions made by her students, or students of her students. The network of sky watchers she helped create continued to function across the Great Plains for generations, providing early warning systems that protected entire communities from the violent storms that remained a constant threat to anyone living under the open sky. Her life reminds us that survival on the Great Plains wasn't just about individual courage or luck, but about the development and preservation of knowledge systems that could protect entire communities. She represents thousands of similar individuals, weather readers, storm watchers, keepers of sky wisdom, whose names we may not know but whose careful observations and teachings enabled whole peoples to thrive in one of the most tornado-prone regions on Earth. As we drift deeper into this gentle exploration of how humans learn to live with forces far greater than themselves, Whirlwind Woman's story offers us a quiet model of expertise developed through patient attention, responsibility carried with grace, and wisdom shared freely for the benefit of all. Her life illustrates the profound connection between careful observation and survival, between individual gift and community responsibility, between human consciousness and the vast natural forces that shape our world. The storms she learned to read still sweep across those same plains today, following patterns that would be familiar to her experienced eyes. Modern meteorology, with all its technological sophistication, follows principles of observation and prediction that would be recognizable to anyone trained in her methods. But her legacy lives on in the understanding that even the most powerful forces of nature can be lived with safely if we pay attention carefully enough and share what we learn with others who face the same challenges. In the end, Whirlwind Woman's story is not just about weather prediction or survival on the Great Plains. It is about the human capacity to develop profound understanding through patient observation, to carry enormous responsibility with quiet dignity, and to transform personal gifts into community resources that can save lives across generations. It reminds us that true expertise comes not from formal education or technological tools, but from the deep, sustained attention that allows us to read the subtle signs that nature provides for those who know how to look. Her name has faded from most historical records, but her influence continues in every weather prediction that saves lives, in every storm warning that allows people to seek safety, in every moment when human wisdom successfully navigates the dangerous beauty of our natural world. As the night deepens and we drift further into the quiet mysteries of the past, let us turn our attention to the questions that have no easy answers, the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine about how entire peoples learn to live beneath such a vast and temperamental sky. These were civilizations that faced atmospheric forces with a raw immediacy we can barely comprehend today, where a misread cloud formation could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe, where the ability to predict the sky's moods was as crucial as finding water or tracking game. The Great Plains stretch across nearly half a continent, an ocean of grass beneath a dome of sky so enormous it can hold a dozen different weather systems simultaneously. Here, storms can build from nothing to devastating fury in minutes. Tornadoes appear without warning. Blizzards can bury entire landscapes under snow so deep and wind-driven that travelers lose all sense of direction within steps of their shelters. Drought can persist for years, followed by floods that reshape entire river systems in a single season. Into this meteorological chaos, human beings came and not only survived but flourished. They developed cultures of remarkable sophistication, trade networks spanning thousands of miles, agricultural systems that fed millions, and astronomical knowledge that rivaled any civilization on Earth. But perhaps their greatest achievement was something far more subtle. They learned to read the sky with an intimacy and precision that allowed them to dance with forces that remain largely unpredictable even to our modern meteorology. Somewhere in what is now western Kansas, hidden among the tall grass that waves endlessly in the prairie wind, lie the remnants of stone circles. They are not dramatic, these ancient markers barely rise above the earth, weathered smooth by centuries of rain and snow, their original height diminished by the slow accumulation of soil and the patient work of frost and thaw. Most people walking among them would see nothing but random rocks scattered across the landscape, perhaps the remnants of some long-forgotten farm boundary or the detritus left by retreating glaciers. But to those who know what to look for, these circles whisper of something more deliberate, more purposeful. Each circle is roughly 12 to 15 feet in diameter, formed by stones that were clearly placed rather than deposited by natural forces. The rocks show signs of selection and arrangement. They're remarkably uniform in size, chosen for their flat surfaces and stability, placed with gaps that seem intentional rather than haphazard. They appear in clusters, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 circles grouped together, always on slightly elevated ground with clear views in all directions. The positioning is too consistent to be accidental. Every cluster sits at precisely the elevation where you'd want to be to watch weather approaching from the western horizon, while remaining low enough to avoid attracting lightning strikes during severe storms. Archaeological surveys have dated some of them to more than 800 years ago, placing them in the era when the high plains supported complex societies that have left us traces but few names. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found within the circles suggests they were used repeatedly over centuries, possibly by different groups who understood their significance and maintained their purpose across generations of cultural change. What were they for? The stones themselves offer few clues. Unlike the more famous medicine wheels found in the northern plains, those grand astronomical instruments with their careful alignments to solstices and stellar events, these circles contain no obvious astronomical alignments, no burial remains, no artifacts that would clearly indicate their purpose. They are smaller, more humble, more numerous. They simply wait, patient and enigmatic in the grass, holding their secrets with the same quiet persistence as the land itself. But if you sit among them quietly, as archaeologists and tribal elders sometimes do, you begin to notice things. The way the wind moves differently within the circles than around them, creating subtle eddies and calm spots that would be invaluable during the violent atmospheric events that regularly sweep across these plains. The subtle depression in the center of each ring, as if something heavy once rested there for long periods. Not the deep pit of a fire hearth, but the gentle settling that comes from repeated placement of substantial objects or prolonged human occupation. The fact that they're positioned exactly where you would want to be if you needed to watch for weather approaching from any direction, high enough for good visibility across the vast grasslands, positioned to catch the first glimpses of cloud formations building along the distant horizons, but not so high as to attract the lightning strikes that make elevated positions deadly during the thunderstorms that can appear with terrifying suddenness across these open spaces. Some scholars suggest they were teepee rings, the stone anchors that held down the edges of portable dwellings, preventing the fierce prairie winds from collapsing or destroying these crucial shelters. This is certainly possible, and many authentic teepee rings do exist across the plains, serving as permanent markers of temporary camps that were used seasonally for thousands of years. The evidence for this interpretation includes the appropriate size and the wear patterns on stones that suggest they once held down flexible materials like hide or canvas. But these circles have a different feeling, a different quality of placement and persistence that suggests something more intentional than simple camping spots. The spacing between circles, the uniformity of their construction, the careful selection of locations, all of this points to specialized use rather than casual habitation. If these were ordinary campsites, we would expect more variation in size, more random positioning, more evidence of the daily activities that leave archaeological traces, food preparation areas, tool-making stations, refuse pits. Instead, what we find suggests ceremony and purpose, repeated ritual activities that left lighter archaeological footprints but required the same locations to be used again and again across centuries. Tribal oral traditions offer intriguing hints, though they must be approached with respectful caution, understanding that these stories have traveled across centuries of cultural disruption and that their original contexts may be significantly different from their current forms. Among some plains peoples, there are stories of special places where the wind spirits could be consulted, where weather readers would go to perform ceremonies aimed at understanding or influencing atmospheric forces. These were not places of worship exactly, but places of conversation, spots where the boundary between human knowledge and natural power became thin enough to allow for communion. The concept of weather spirits was far more sophisticated among plains peoples than early European observers understood. These weren't simple personifications of natural forces, but complex understandings of atmospheric systems as manifestations of conscious, powerful beings who operated according to their own logic and motivations. Successful interaction with these beings required not just knowledge of their patterns and preferences, but understanding of proper protocols, appropriate offerings, and the delicate social dynamics that governed relationships between humans and powers far greater than themselves. The Lakota speak of places where the thunder beings, Wakinyan Oyate, the Thunder Nation, powerful spirits who controlled storms and rain, could be approached with proper ceremony and respect. These beings were not evil, but they were dangerous in the way that all great powers are dangerous, like approaching a massive waterfall or standing at the edge of a deep canyon. They required careful handling, specific protocols, precise offerings of tobacco and prayer, and above all, the kind of respectful humility that acknowledges one's small place in a vast system of interconnected forces. The thunder beings were understood to be teachers as well as powers to be feared. They could grant visions that revealed weather patterns, provide warnings of dangerous storms, and even offer protection during the most violent atmospheric events. But they demanded reciprocity. Humans who sought their knowledge had to give something back, to demonstrate their understanding that this wisdom came at a cost and carried responsibilities. The Pawnee had ceremonies related to the morning star and the powers of the sky, rituals that involved careful observation of weather patterns and atmospheric conditions as part of larger astronomical and agricultural cycles. Their earth lodges were built with smoke holes oriented not just for ventilation, but to allow for sky watching, positioned so that observers could track the movement of stars, clouds, and atmospheric phenomena throughout the night. Their agricultural calendar was intimately tied to their understanding of seasonal weather patterns, with planting and harvesting timed to work with rather than against the complex atmospheric cycles that determine moisture, temperature, and wind patterns across the plains. But perhaps the most intriguing stories come from the Cheyenne, who speak of the whirlwind spirit, a being of immense power who could appear as a tornado or dust devil, and who required special knowledge to approach safely. According to some versions of these stories, there were individuals who could communicate with this spirit, learning from it the secrets of wind and weather that allowed their people to survive the most dangerous storms. These weather readers, as they might be called, were not simply meteorologists in the modern sense. They were individuals who combined careful empirical observation with spiritual practice, understanding that successful prediction of atmospheric events required both technical knowledge and proper relationships with the powers that controlled those events. They studied cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and plant responses to changing atmospheric pressure. But they also maintained ceremonial responsibilities, performing regular offerings and prayers that kept them in good standing with the spirits whose cooperation they required. Could the stone circles have been places where such ceremonies took place? spots specifically chosen and prepared for the delicate work of reading the sky and communicating with the forces that controlled it. The positioning certainly suggests someone who understood weather patterns intimately, elevated enough for good observation, positioned to take advantage of the natural wind patterns that flow across the plains, but in locations that seem to naturally channel and calm atmospheric turbulence in ways that would make them safer during violent storms. The geographic distribution of the circles supports this interpretation. They appear along the pathways that major storm systems follow as they move across the continental interior, positioned like a network of observation posts that could track the development and movement of weather systems across hundreds of miles. If you plot their locations on a map and overlay it with modern meteorological data about storm tracks and wind patterns, the correlation is remarkable. Moreover, many of the circle sites show evidence of being used during specific seasons, particularly during the spring and early summer months when the most dangerous thunderstorms and tornadoes occur across the plains. Pollen analysis and seasonal plant remains suggest that these locations saw their heaviest use during the peak of storm season, exactly when weather reading skills would be most crucial for community survival. Archaeological evidence offers tantalizing glimpses but no definitive answers. Excavations within the circles sometimes reveal traces of repeated fires, but these are not ordinary cooking hearths or warming fires. The burn patterns suggest carefully controlled ceremonial fires burned at specific temperatures and maintained for precise durations. The ash contains traces of specific plants: sage, sweetgrass, cedar, and tobacco, all materials associated with ceremonial activities and offerings to spiritual powers. Occasionally, small offerings appear in the archaeological record: fragments of carved bone bearing symbols that might relate to weather patterns, pieces of worked stone that could be weather prediction tools, traces of tobacco or other plants used in ritual contexts, but nothing that clearly explains their primary purpose in terms that our modern categories can easily accommodate. Perhaps the most intriguing finds are the small carved stones, no bigger than a person's palm, that occasionally appear in or near the circles. These bear symbols that have resisted interpretation: spiral patterns that might represent wind or storm systems, radial designs that could relate to the sun or to the circular patterns that storms create, geometric forms that might be mnemonic devices for remembering complex weather prediction systems. Some archaeologists have suggested these might be early forms of weather maps, physical objects that weather readers used to record and remember the patterns they observed, teaching tools for passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The symbols often appear in sequences, suggesting they might be read as narratives or instructions, stories that encode crucial information about atmospheric behavior in memorable, portable form. What we do know is that plains peoples developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for understanding and predicting weather patterns. This knowledge wasn't just practical, it was also deeply spiritual, woven into complex belief systems that understood weather as the manifestation of powerful spiritual beings who required respect, offerings, and careful protocols for safe interaction. This integration of practical and spiritual knowledge created remarkably effective systems for dealing with atmospheric uncertainty. By embedding technical information within ceremonial contexts, plain societies ensured that crucial survival knowledge would be preserved and transmitted across generations, even during periods of social upheaval or cultural change. Consider the Arapaho tradition of the Wind River Medicine Lodge, where weather watching was part of a larger ceremonial complex aimed at maintaining harmony between human communities and the natural forces that surrounded them. The lodge itself was constructed according to specific principles that reflected understanding of atmospheric dynamics, positioned to avoid downdrafts and wind shear, built with materials that could withstand sudden temperature changes, oriented to take advantage of natural protection while maintaining clear sightlines to all quarters of the sky. Participants in these ceremonies would fast and pray while observing sky conditions, but this wasn't simply passive spiritual practice. The fasting heightened their sensitivity to atmospheric changes, shifts in air pressure, humidity, temperature gradients that indicate approaching weather systems. The prayer and meditation created the focused mental state necessary for processing complex environmental information, the kind of subtle pattern recognition that requires both intense concentration and relaxed awareness. These weather watchers sought not just knowledge of coming weather, but understanding of their proper relationship with the powers that controlled it. They learned to read the sky not as passive observers, but as participants in ongoing relationships with atmospheric forces, understanding that successful prediction required maintaining these relationships through proper ceremony and respectful behavior. Or think about the Kiowa tradition of the gourd dance, performed partly as a way of honoring the spirits of wind and storm. The gourd rattles used in the dance were said to mimic the sound of hail or rain, creating a sympathetic connection between human ceremony and atmospheric forces. But this wasn't simple imitative magic. The dancers were also highly skilled observers of weather patterns, and the dance provided a framework for sharing and preserving meteorological knowledge within the community. Dancers would sometimes report visions or dreams that provided guidance about weather patterns or safe travel times, but these visions were grounded in careful observation of natural signs. A dancer who reported a vision of approaching storms had likely noticed subtle changes in wind patterns, animal behavior, or atmospheric clarity that indicated developing weather systems. The vision provided a socially acceptable way to share technical knowledge while embedding it within the spiritual framework that gave it authority and ensured it would be remembered. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated knowledge systems that combined careful empirical observation with ritual frameworks designed to preserve and transmit crucial survival information across generations. The spiritual aspects of weather reading served practical purposes. They provided memorable contexts for technical knowledge, created social structures for training specialists, offered psychological frameworks for living with constant uncertainty, and established protocols for sharing information that could mean the difference between life and death. But there are deeper mysteries still, traces of knowledge that we can only glimpse indirectly through the archaeological record and the fragments of oral tradition that have survived into the present. These hints suggest that Plains peoples developed not just individual skills for weather prediction, but entire infrastructures for understanding and responding to atmospheric events. In the Black Hills of South Dakota, there are caves that show evidence of repeated use during storms, not just casual shelter seeking, but deliberate prepared occupation during specific weather events. The caves contain fire hearths positioned to avoid smoke problems during high winds, ventilation systems that remain functional even when outside air pressure drops dramatically, storage areas for supplies that would be needed during extended severe weather, and sometimes carved symbols that seem to relate to weather patterns or storm calendars. The positioning of these supplies and facilities suggests advanced preparation for specific types of weather events. Different caves show evidence of preparation for different types of storms, some equipped for blizzards with large stores of fuel and food, others prepared for tornado season with rapid access storage and emergency equipment. This wasn't random preparation, but systematic infrastructure designed by people who understood the different types of atmospheric threats they faced and had developed specific responses to each. Were these emergency shelters places where Plains peoples would retreat during the most violent weather? Or were they something more, specialized locations where weather readers would go to observe and interpret the most dangerous storms from positions of relative safety? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete, but it suggests a level of weather-related infrastructure that goes far beyond what we usually associate with nomadic peoples. The caves often contain multiple levels of occupation, suggesting they were used repeatedly over long periods. But the pattern of use is seasonal and event-specific rather than continuous. Carbon dating of organic remains shows peaks of activity that correspond with major storm systems, periods when multiple caves across wide areas show simultaneous occupation, as if coordinated responses to large-scale weather events. Similarly mysterious are the vision quest sites found throughout the region, isolated spots, often on high ground, where individuals would go to fast and pray for spiritual guidance. Many of these sites show clear evidence of weather-watching activities, stone arrangements that create natural windbreaks while maintaining clear sight lines in all directions, carefully positioned fire hearths that would remain usable even in high winds, and sometimes carved or painted symbols that seem to record specific weather events or patterns. The stone arrangements at these sites are particularly intriguing. They're not random piles, but carefully engineered structures that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of wind patterns and atmospheric dynamics. Some create complex systems of windbreaks and channels that would allow observers to remain in position during severe weather while maintaining the visibility necessary for tracking storm development. Others appear to be designed as acoustic amplifiers, positioned to take advantage of the way sound travels during different atmospheric conditions. Experienced plainspeople could identify approaching weather systems by sound long before they became visible. The low-frequency rumble of distant thunder, the particular whistle that wind makes when it encounters certain types of cloud formations, the subtle changes in ambient sound that indicate shifting air pressure. Was weather reading considered a form of vision quest among some plains peoples? Were the individuals who developed expertise in atmospheric prediction understood to be receiving spiritual guidance as well as accumulating practical knowledge? The available evidence suggests that the line between meteorological expertise and spiritual authority was often blurred, with the same individuals serving as both weather readers and ceremonial leaders. This makes perfect sense when we consider the life or death importance of accurate weather prediction in plain societies. The ability to anticipate severe storms, locate water during droughts, predict the timing of seasonal changes, these skills were literally matters of survival for entire communities. It's natural that individuals who possessed such crucial knowledge would be accorded special status and that their expertise would be understood in spiritual as well as practical terms. Many of the Vision Quest sites show evidence of repeated use by the same individuals over long periods. The arrangement of stones and facilities suggests spaces designed for specific people with specific needs rather than generic spiritual retreat locations. Some sites show evidence of specialized equipment, unusual stone tools that might be weather instruments, carved markers that could be used for timing observations, storage areas for materials needed for weather prediction ceremonies. The most intriguing sites show evidence of complex preparation rituals. Excavation reveals layers of ceremonial materials, special soils, plant remains, carved objects that were placed in specific sequences over time. This suggests that weather reading required not just individual skill, but elaborate preparation, the creation of ceremonial contexts that enhanced the observer's ability to perceive and interpret atmospheric conditions. Even more intriguing are the scattered references in early missionary and trader accounts to individuals who claimed the ability to influence weather patterns, not just predict them. These reports are often dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, but they appear frequently enough across different tribal groups and time periods to suggest some underlying reality. Father Pierre Jean de Smay, a Jesuit missionary who spent decades among plains tribes in the mid-1800s, wrote detailed accounts of ceremonies he observed that were specifically aimed at influencing weather. He described elaborate rituals involving multiple participants, complex timing based on atmospheric observations, and the use of specialized equipment and materials. While he interpreted these ceremonies through his own religious framework, his description suggests sophisticated understanding of atmospheric processes. Similarly, fur traders and early explorers often reported encounters with individuals who demonstrated uncanny abilities to predict and seemingly influence weather patterns. These accounts are scattered across different expeditions and time periods, but they share common elements: descriptions of people who could accurately predict storms days in advance, locate water during droughts, and perform ceremonies that seem to coincide with changes in weather patterns. What might this have looked like in practice? Perhaps ritual specialists who combine deep knowledge of atmospheric patterns with carefully timed ceremonies designed to work with natural weather cycles rather than against them. Individuals who understood, for example, that certain types of offerings or prayers performed at specific moments in a storm's development might influence its direction or intensity, not through supernatural intervention, but through sophisticated understanding of meteorological cause and effect. Modern meteorology recognizes that atmospheric systems are incredibly sensitive to small changes in initial conditions. The butterfly effect isn't just a metaphor. Tiny variations in temperature, humidity, or air pressure can cascade into major changes in weather patterns over time. Perhaps plains weather workers understood this intuitively, developing techniques for introducing small changes at crucial moments when atmospheric systems were most susceptible to influence. This wouldn't require supernatural powers, just extraordinarily detailed knowledge of atmospheric dynamics combined with precise timing and the ability to make subtle but significant changes to local conditions. A ceremony that involved burning specific materials at exactly the right moment might change local air temperature or humidity just enough to influence the development of a nearby storm system. The line between science and spirituality was not as clear for plains peoples as it is for us. Weather reading was simultaneously practical skill, ceremonial responsibility, and spiritual calling. The stone circles, the vision quest sites, the storm caves, all of these mysterious remnants suggest a civilization that developed remarkably sophisticated ways of living safely with atmospheric forces that remain dangerous and unpredictable even today. These knowledge systems operated according to principles that don't fit neatly into our modern categories. They were simultaneously empirical and mystical, individual and communal, practical and ceremonial. They required not just technical knowledge but spiritual preparation, not just observation skills but ceremonial authority, not just individual expertise but community support and recognition. The sophistication of these systems becomes apparent when we consider the mathematical complexity hidden within traditional weather prediction methods. Plains peoples developed ways of tracking multiple atmospheric variables simultaneously: wind speed and direction at different altitudes, temperature gradients across large areas, humidity patterns, air pressure changes, cloud formation sequences, and integrating this information into accurate predictions of future weather conditions. They did this without instruments, relying entirely on direct sensory observation enhanced by techniques that heightened their sensitivity to environmental changes. Fasting, meditation, exposure to different atmospheric conditions, the use of natural substances that affected perception. All of these practices serve to enhance the weather reader's ability to detect subtle environmental cues that indicated developing weather patterns. The knowledge was preserved and transmitted through complex systems that combined direct instruction with ceremonial practice. Young weather readers learned not just what to observe, but how to observe it. Not just how to interpret atmospheric signs, but how to maintain the spiritual relationships that made such interpretation possible. These teaching methods created remarkably robust knowledge preservation systems. Because the information was embedded within ceremonial contexts and spiritual practices, it was more likely to survive cultural disruptions that might destroy purely practical knowledge. The spiritual framework provided motivation for learning and practicing weather reading skills even when they weren't immediately needed for survival. The mathematical precision hidden within these systems is only now becoming apparent as we develop more sophisticated understanding of atmospheric dynamics. Many traditional weather prediction methods that seemed like folklore or superstition turn out to be based on accurate understanding of complex meteorological principles. For example, traditional methods for predicting tornado formation by observing cloud color and movement patterns correspond closely to modern understanding of the atmospheric conditions that create tornadoes. Traditional techniques for predicting drought by observing animal behavior and plant responses reflect sophisticated understanding of the early indicators of changing precipitation patterns. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, imagine yourself sitting within one of those ancient stone circles, feeling the grass bend around you in patterns created by winds that have blown across these same plains for thousands of years. The stones beneath your hands are warm from the day's sun, but cooling now as night approaches, their thermal mass creating subtle microclimates that would have been invaluable to the weather readers who once used these spaces. Above you, stars appear in the same positions they held when people whose names we'll never know sat in this same spot, watching the same sky, reading the same atmospheric signs that still determine life and death on the Great Plains. The Milky Way stretches overhead in the same brilliant arc, but these ancient observers saw patterns within it that served as calendars and navigation aids, understood its seasonal movements as indicators of weather changes and agricultural timing. What did they see in those star patterns that we have forgotten? What conversations did they have with wind and thunder that we can no longer hear? What knowledge did they carry about the intimate relationship between earth and sky that disappeared when their voices fell silent? The questions echo across the centuries, as persistent as the wind itself. These ancient weather readers developed an intimacy with atmospheric forces that we can barely imagine. They could feel approaching storms in their bones, sense pressure changes through subtle shifts in their own bodies' responses to the environment. They read the sky like a vast, constantly changing text, understanding cloud formations as a complex language that spoke of atmospheric conditions across hundreds of miles. They knew which stars were obscured by the thin, high clouds that indicate approaching storm systems, how the behavior of insects and birds changed in response to barometric pressure, which plants closed their leaves or changed their scent when atmospheric humidity shifted. This knowledge was accumulated over generations, refined through countless observations, and preserved within ceremonial traditions that ensured its transmission across time. The intimacy of this relationship with atmospheric forces created a fundamentally different way of being in the world. Where we experience weather as something that happens to us, an external force that we monitor through instruments and respond to with technology, Plains peoples experienced weather as something they participated in, a relationship they maintained through ongoing ceremonial and practical engagement. This participation didn't mean they could control weather systems through wishful thinking or simple ritual action. Rather, it meant they understood themselves as part of the atmospheric system, able to influence it in small ways and be influenced by it in profound ways, participants in ongoing conversations between earth and sky that required both technical knowledge and spiritual sensitivity. The stones remember, but they speak in a language we're still learning to understand. Each circle holds traces of countless ceremonies, thousands of hours of patient observation, generations of accumulated knowledge about atmospheric patterns and their relationships to human survival. The wear patterns on the stones, the subtle depressions in the earth, the arrangement of organic materials in the soil, all of these elements contain information that we're only beginning to learn how to read. The grass remembers, bending in patterns that echo conversations between wind and ground, stretching back countless generations. The root systems beneath the circles show distinctive patterns of growth and disturbance that suggest long-term human use of these spaces for specific purposes. Pollen trapped in the soil reveals the plants that were brought to these locations for ceremonial purposes, offering clues about the rituals that once took place here. The sky remembers, carrying the same storms across the same landscapes, following patterns that human eyes have watched and tried to understand since people first learned to read the weather's moods. The jet stream flows above these sites along paths that were understood by ancient weather readers, bringing moisture and temperature changes that were predicted and prepared for by people who understood atmospheric dynamics with remarkable precision. Satellite imagery reveals patterns invisible from ground level, ancient pathways between circle sites, subtle earthworks that channel water and wind, agricultural areas that were positioned to take advantage of microclimates created by the circles themselves. This suggests that the weather reading infrastructure was part of larger landscape management systems that integrated atmospheric knowledge with agricultural and settlement planning. These mysteries remain with us, patient and persistent as the land itself, waiting for the right questions, the right attention, the right combination of scientific curiosity and respectful wonder to unlock their secrets. Modern meteorology provides tools for understanding atmospheric dynamics that the ancient weather readers lacked, but they possessed forms of environmental sensitivity and integration that our technological approach to weather prediction has largely abandoned. Perhaps the key to understanding these ancient systems lies not in choosing between scientific and spiritual approaches to weather, but in recognizing that the most sophisticated weather reading systems combined both forms of knowledge in integrated ways that enhanced rather than contradicted each other. For now, they simply endure, marking places where humans once developed extraordinary intimacy with forces far greater than themselves, creating knowledge systems that allowed entire peoples to thrive in partnership with powers that remain wild and unpredictable today. They stand as monuments to forms of human knowledge that we're only beginning to appreciate, reminders that there are many ways of understanding the natural world, and that our current approaches, however sophisticated, represent only one possible relationship between human consciousness and atmospheric forces. In the quiet of this moment, as sleep begins to take hold, we can honor these mysteries without needing to solve them, appreciating the sophistication and wisdom they represent, while acknowledging the limits of what we can know across the great distances of time and cultural difference. We can recognize that the ancient weather readers achieved something remarkable. They learned to live safely and prosperously within atmospheric systems that still challenge our most advanced technologies and scientific understanding. The wind still blows across those stone circles, carrying scents and temperatures that would have been meaningful to the weather readers who once sat within them. The storms still build on the western horizon, following paths that were predicted and prepared for by people whose knowledge systems we're still trying to understand. And somewhere in the space between knowing and mystery, between science and ceremony, between individual observation and community wisdom, the legacy of the weather readers continues to whisper its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen, reminding us that the sky holds mysteries as deep and enduring as the earth itself. As our quiet journey through time continues to unfold, let us now drift into the subtle hierarchies and contrasts that existed even in societies that lived so intimately with the democratic forces of wind and weather. For even under the vast, impartial sky of the Great Plains, some shelters were stronger than others, some positions offered more protection, and some people slept more soundly when the thunder began to roll across the darkness. These differences, carved out by circumstance, choice, and the accumulated weight of generations, created invisible maps of safety and vulnerability that the tornadoes would trace with devastating precision. The Great Plains had always been a landscape where equality and inequality existed in constant tension. The weather struck rich and poor, powerful and powerless with the same indiscriminate violence, yet the resources available to face that violence varied dramatically. A single storm could reveal the full spectrum of human adaptation to this challenging environment, from the most sophisticated traditional knowledge systems to the newest experiments in frontier architecture, from the mobility that meant survival to the permanence that promised security. Picture, if you will, a late summer evening in 1847 at the Bellevue Mission, a small outpost perched on the bluffs above the Missouri River in what would become Nebraska. The mission sits like a statement of intention against the horizon, its squared lines and vertical walls declaring human determination to impose order on a landscape that recognizes no such boundaries. Inside the mission's thick log walls, Reverend Edward McKinney sits at his wooden desk, writing by candlelight in his daily journal. The walls around him are solid oak, each log carefully selected from the dense forests along the Missouri River bottoms, chinked with clay and moss, built to withstand the harsh winters and violent storms of the frontier. These walls represent more than mere construction. They embody a particular philosophy about how humans should relate to their environment. Each log was cut with saws brought from eastern factories, shaped with tools forged in distant foundries, assembled according to building techniques developed in climates far gentler than this one. The very existence of these walls required a supply chain that stretched back to Boston and Philadelphia, a network of relationships that connected this remote outpost to the industrial centers of a rapidly changing nation. Above his head, heavy timber beams support a roof of split shingles weighted down with stones, a roof that has already weathered 3 tornado seasons without significant damage. The construction reflects a hybrid wisdom, European building techniques adapted to Great Plains realities. The stones that hold down the shingles were gathered from creek beds by Omaha workers who understood intimately the lifting power of prairie winds. The timber itself was shaped by German immigrants who brought centuries of Black Forest carpentry traditions to bear on the challenge of prairie storms. McKinney himself represents another kind of hybrid adaptation. Born in Massachusetts and educated at Andover Seminary, he has spent the last 2 years learning to read the signs of weather in a landscape his theological training never prepared him to understand. His journal entries from earlier months reveal a gradual education in frontier meteorology, notes about the color of western skies that seem to predict violent weather, observations about how his horses behave when atmospheric pressure drops, careful records of which types of storms cause the most damage to different kinds of structures. Outside, the evening air carries that familiar metallic taste that every Great Plains resident learns to recognize, the sharp, electrical smell that means the atmosphere is charging itself for violence. The wind is beginning to shift in the restless way that means weather is building somewhere beyond the western horizon, where thunderheads tower like mountains made of vapor and electricity. But Reverend McKinney, despite 2 years of frontier education, barely notices these signs tonight. His attention is focused on his correspondence with the mission board back in Boston, his careful accounting of supplies distributed to local native families, his plans for the small school he hopes to establish next spring. The letters he writes home reveal the complex position he occupies in this landscape of competing survival strategies. To his sponsors in Boston, he describes the mission's success in bringing civilization and Christianity to the frontier. But his private journal tells a different story, one of constant learning from the very people he was sent to convert. His accounts of severe weather increasingly read like translations from Omaha and Ponca knowledge systems, traditional understandings of atmospheric patterns that he has begun to incorporate into his own survival strategies. He has been at Bellevue for 2 years now, long enough to understand that severe weather is simply a fact of life in this place, but not long enough to read the subtle signs that would tell him tonight might be different from other stormy evenings. When the wind picks up and begins to howl around the corners of the mission building, he simply closes the shutters more tightly and adds another log to the fire. The thick walls muffle the sound of the storm to a comfortable background murmur, no more alarming than rain on a roof. But those same walls that provide comfort also create a kind of insulation from the environmental knowledge he needs to survive in this place. The mission's solid construction encourages a false sense of security, a belief that European building techniques can simply overpower Great Plains weather rather than learning to work with it. This architectural confidence reflects a broader cultural assumption that civilization means imposing human will on natural forces rather than developing the kind of negotiated relationship with the environment that characterizes indigenous survival strategies. 3 miles away, in a camp beside the creek that the locals call Papillion, a different kind of evening is unfolding. Here, 47 Omaha people are spending a few days in temporary shelters while traveling to their winter hunting grounds. Their teepees are well made and carefully maintained, but they remain fundamentally what they have always been: portable shelters designed for a people who must be ready to move quickly when conditions require it. These structures represent a completely different philosophy of human-environment relationships. Where the mission's walls declare permanent human presence and dominance, the teepees acknowledge the temporary nature of any human occupation of this landscape. They are designed not to resist the power of Great Plains weather, but to survive it through flexibility, mobility, and the kind of accumulated knowledge that comes from countless generations of intimate attention to atmospheric patterns. Each teepee in the camp tells its own story of adaptation and resource management. The poles that form their frames were cut in the distant Black Hills during the previous summer's journey, selected for their straightness and strength, seasoned over months of travel. The buffalo hide covers represent the accumulated wealth of successful hunts, the products of complex social relationships involving entire extended families in the work of bringing down, processing, and preparing the massive animals that provided both food and shelter materials. Among these teepees sits one that is noticeably larger and more elaborate than the others. It belongs to Iron Eye, a respected leader whose family has accumulated enough wealth and status to afford extra buffalo hides, longer lodge poles, and more decorative elements in their home's construction. The teepee can house 12 people comfortably, with a large fire ring in the center and sleeping areas arranged in a circle around the walls. Thick buffalo robes cover the floor, and parfleche containers filled with the family's most valuable possessions line the walls. Iron Eye's shelter represents the pinnacle of Plains Indian architecture, not just a dwelling, but a complex system of environmental adaptation refined over centuries. The teepee's conical shape deflects wind rather than resisting it. The smoke flaps at the top can be adjusted to account for changing wind directions, and the entire structure can be erected or dismantled by an experienced crew in less than an hour. Most importantly, the family that lives in it maintains the mobility necessary to move away from dangerous weather when traditional knowledge systems indicate that such movement is necessary. But for all its relative luxury and sophisticated engineering, Iron Eye's teepee remains a structure of poles and hides held to the earth by stakes and sinew, dependent on the strength of materials that, however skillfully prepared, cannot match the solid permanence of oak logs and stone foundations. This is not a failure of technology, but a conscious choice, a commitment to maintaining the mobility that has enabled his people to survive on the Great Plains for countless generations. The teepee's decorative elements tell stories that connect its inhabitants to landscape and weather patterns. Painted symbols record successful hunts, significant weather events, and spiritual visions that provide guidance for reading natural signs. These decorations are not merely artistic, but functional. They encode traditional knowledge in visual form, ensuring that essential survival information remains accessible to future generations, even when specific elders are no longer available to share their wisdom. When the wind begins to rise tonight, Iron Eye will do what his family has done for countless generations: listen carefully, watch for signs of serious danger, and trust in their collective knowledge of how to survive whatever the sky might send. This knowledge represents a different kind of wealth from the material accumulation displayed in the teepee's construction. It cannot be stolen or destroyed, but it requires constant cultivation and renewal through careful attention to environmental signs. The contrast between these two approaches to shelter and safety becomes most apparent when the storm finally arrives. At the mission, Reverend McKinney experiences the tornado's passage as a dramatic but largely abstract event. The building shudders and groans as winds that he will later learn exceeded 100 miles per hour tear at the heavy log walls. The shutters strain against their hinges, and somewhere above him, loose shingles are being stripped away and flung into the darkness. The sound is tremendous, a roaring that seems to come from all directions at once, but the fundamental structure of his shelter holds firm. Inside the mission's main room, McKinney crouches beside his overturned desk, praying earnestly while books and papers swirl around him in the drafts that find their way through chinks in the log walls. The building's construction proves its worth. The heavy timber frame flexes under the enormous pressure but does not break. The thick walls channel the wind's force around rather than through the structure, and the stone-weighted roof, though losing individual shingles, maintains its overall integrity. But even as the mission's physical structure protects him, McKinney realizes how little he understands about what he is experiencing. The storm's approach gave him no warning beyond the general sense of unsettled weather that he has learned to expect during late summer on the Great Plains. He has no framework for understanding the specific atmospheric conditions that produce tornadoes, no traditional knowledge system that might have helped him prepare more effectively for this particular type of violent weather. His survival depends entirely on the European construction techniques embodied in the mission's walls, a passive form of protection that requires no knowledge or skill on his part, but also offers no opportunity to actively engage with the environmental forces threatening his safety. He can only wait, pray, and hope that materials and techniques developed for different climates will prove adequate to Great Plains realities. When morning comes, he will find damage but not destruction. Some shingles gone, one shutter torn loose, a large cottonwood tree fallen across the mission's vegetable garden. Inconvenient and expensive to repair, but not catastrophic. He will write in his journal about the terrific gale that passed in the night, noting with satisfaction how well the mission's sturdy construction weathered the storm. But his account will also reveal the isolation that his solid shelter creates. Protected by thick walls from the storm's immediate violence, he was also insulated from the environmental knowledge that might have helped him understand what he was experiencing. His description of the tornado will remain superficial, focused on its effects on human constructions rather than its place in larger patterns of Great Plains weather and ecology. 3 miles away, Iron Eye's people experience the same tornado as a much more immediate and personal force. They have perhaps 20 minutes of warning, time enough to recognize that this is not ordinary storm weather, time enough to gather children and essential belongings, time enough to make the crucial decision about where to seek shelter. The warning comes not from any single dramatic sign, but from a complex constellation of environmental indicators that traditional knowledge has taught them to read as a coherent pattern. The horses are the first to signal danger, gathering in tight groups with their heads turned away from the western sky. The dogs begin to whine and pace restlessly. The air pressure drops in a way that sensitive individuals can feel in their bones, and the wind shifts through a specific sequence of directions that experienced weather readers recognize as the signature of rotating storm systems. Most telling of all, the very quality of the light begins to change. The late afternoon sun takes on a peculiar greenish tint that traditionally trained observers know indicates the presence of large hail in distant thunderclouds. The western sky darkens in a way that suggests not ordinary storm clouds, but the kind of organized rotating supercells that spawn the most violent tornadoes. Iron Eye stands outside his teepee, reading these signs with the accumulated wisdom of 40 years of life on the Great Plains. His knowledge comes not from books or formal education, but from a lifetime of careful attention to environmental patterns, guided by elders who learn the same skills from their own mentors in an unbroken chain of knowledge transmission stretching back through countless generations. The creek bed offers the best protection, a natural depression lined with willows that will bend rather than break in high winds. The formation of the land creates a slight valley that tornadoes often skip over, following the easier path of ridgelines and open prairie. But reaching this shelter means abandoning not just their temporary camp, but also their horses, their food stores, their tools and weapons, everything that enables their mobile way of life. I makes the decision that leaders must make, people first, possessions second. But this is not a simple calculation of material wealth against human life. The possessions being abandoned represent years of accumulated resources, the products of successful hunts and careful management of family assets. Losing them means not just immediate hardship, but potential future vulnerability, reduced capacity to survive the challenging winter months ahead. His voice carries across the camp over the rising wind as he calls for everyone to move quickly to the creek bottom. The decision spreads through traditional communication networks, not just his direct commands, but the response of family leaders who trust his judgment and add their own authority to the call for evacuation. In minutes, a camp of 47 people transforms from a settled community to a group of refugees carrying only what they can lift and run with. Families grab their children, their warmest robes, their most essential tools. Everything else, including the magnificent teepee that represents years of I&I's family's accumulated wealth, must be left to the mercy of the storm. But even this abandonment follows traditional patterns of priority and value. Sacred objects and family medicine bundles take precedence over mere material wealth. Essential tools for making fire and processing food rank higher than decorative items or extra clothing. The movement to shelter reveals the social structures that govern survival in this community. Elders and small children are assisted first, their needs taking priority over those of adults who can manage their own evacuation. Families with horses use them to carry those who cannot walk quickly, while others take responsibility for essential community resources like fire-making materials and emergency food supplies. They huddle in the creek bed as the tornado passes, 47 people pressed together in a natural shelter, barely large enough to hold them all. The willows bend over them like a living roof, their flexible branches absorbing and dissipating the wind's force rather than breaking under its pressure. The creek's depression in the landscape creates a partial wind shadow, a zone of relative calm in the midst of atmospheric chaos. The sound above them is indescribable, not just wind, but the screaming of air being torn apart, the crash of trees falling, the strange whistling howl that tornadoes make as they consume everything in their path. But even in this moment of terror, traditional knowledge continues to operate. Experienced individuals listen to the storm's sounds, tracking its movement and intensity, making the calculations that will determine when it is safe to emerge from shelter. The children, frightened but not panicked, huddle close to adults who sing traditional songs in low voices, not just for comfort, but as a way of maintaining cultural continuity in the face of natural violence. The songs encode additional knowledge about storms and survival, traditional wisdom passed down through generations in forms that can be remembered and transmitted even under the most challenging circumstances. When it passes and they finally dare to climb back up to where their camp had been, they find a landscape transformed. The teepees are gone, not damaged, but completely gone, as if they had never existed. Lodge poles that had been cut in distant mountains and carried hundreds of miles are scattered across the prairie like toothpicks. Buffalo hides that represented the work of entire hunting seasons lie in shredded pieces wrapped around the few trees that remain standing. The horses released from their hobbles when the evacuation began have scattered across the prairie. Some will be recovered in the coming days, but others are already lost forever, adding to the storm's toll. Food supplies carefully preserved for the winter journey have been scattered and contaminated. Tools and weapons accumulated over years of careful trading have vanished into the darkness. I stands in the middle of what had been his home just hours before, holding his youngest child and surveying the complete destruction of his family's accumulated wealth. But everyone is alive. Everyone is unharmed. The decision to abandon everything and run for shelter has saved 47 lives, even as it has cost them nearly everything they owned. This moment crystallizes the fundamental difference between wealth as material accumulation and wealth as survival knowledge. I's family has lost possessions that represented years of successful hunting and trading, but they retain the knowledge systems that enabled them to read the storm's approach and respond appropriately. This knowledge cannot be destroyed by wind, scattered by tornadoes, or lost to atmospheric violence. It exists in their minds and bodies, in their collective memory and shared understanding of environmental patterns. The recovery will be long and difficult. Winter is approaching, and the storm has destroyed many of the resources they would normally depend on to survive the cold months. But the same traditional knowledge systems that enabled them to survive the tornado will also guide their response to its aftermath. They know which plants can be harvested late in the season, where to find emergency shelter, how to request assistance from related bands, and how to rebuild their material wealth through the complex networks of reciprocity that bind Great Plains communities together. This is the fundamental difference that tornado weather revealed between different ways of living on the Great Plains. Those who lived in permanent structures, missionaries, traders, military personnel, government agents, could often ride out even severe storms with manageable damage. Their thick-walled buildings, root cellars, and solid construction provided genuine protection against all but the most violent tornadoes. They might lose a roof or a window, but they rarely lost their homes entirely. But this protection came with costs that went beyond the immediate expense of construction materials and skilled labor. Permanent structures tied their inhabitants to specific locations, making them dependent on supply lines that could be disrupted by weather, warfare, or economic instability. They also created a psychological distance from environmental knowledge systems, encouraging reliance on material solutions rather than the kind of adaptive intelligence that traditional communities had developed over generations. Those who lived in mobile shelters faced a starker choice: run or risk everything. Their teepees and temporary structures, however well made, simply could not withstand direct hits from major tornadoes. But their mobility was also their salvation. They could read weather signs, make quick decisions, and move to safety in ways that people tied to permanent locations could not. This mobility represented a different kind of insurance against natural disasters. Rather than building structures strong enough to withstand any possible weather event, traditional Great Plains communities developed the knowledge and social flexibility necessary to avoid the most dangerous encounters with violent weather altogether. Their survival strategy was based on movement and adaptation rather than resistance and material accumulation. Even within native communities, however, subtle hierarchies of shelter and safety existed. Medicine societies and ceremonial leaders sometimes had access to more substantial structures, earth lodges among the Pawnee, for example, or large council teepees among the Plains Cree that were reinforced with extra poles and heavier materials. These structures offered better protection than ordinary family dwellings, but they also represented forms of privilege and accumulated resources that not everyone could access. Consider the difference between sleeping in a large, well-appointed council lodge and spending the night in a hastily constructed lean-to at the edge of camp. Both shelters might be considered traditional native housing, but when tornado winds began to blow, the person in the council lodge had significantly better chances of surviving the night unharmed. These differences were not arbitrary but reflected complex social arrangements that balanced individual needs against community survival. Sacred leaders and keepers of essential knowledge might receive priority access, to the safest shelters because their survival was considered crucial to the entire group's long-term welfare. Skilled artisans whose abilities were essential for making the tools and weapons needed for community survival might also receive preferential treatment during dangerous weather events. But these hierarchies also created obligations. Those who received better protection were expected to use their positions of relative safety to help ensure community survival during and after dangerous weather events. Leaders were responsible for making evacuation decisions that could save or doom entire communities. Knowledge keepers were expected to maintain and transmit the environmental wisdom that enabled everyone to survive in challenging conditions. Similarly, families with large horse herds had advantages that went beyond simple wealth. Horses were not just transportation and status symbols, they were also early warning systems. A person with 30 horses could afford to keep some of them at a distance from camp specifically to watch for signs of changing weather. Horses' sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes meant that wealthy families often had more advance notice of severe weather than their poorer neighbors who owned only 1 or 2 animals, kept close to camp. These economic differences translated directly into survival advantages during severe weather events. Families with large herds could afford to lose some animals to storms while retaining enough transportation to maintain their mobility. They could also use their horses to assist community members who lacked adequate transportation, but this assistance came with social obligations that reinforced existing hierarchies and relationships of dependence. The arrival of European-style buildings on the Great Plains created new categories of shelter and safety that cut across traditional tribal lines. A native family working at a mission or trading post might have access to log buildings with root cellars, genuine tornado shelters that offered better protection than even the most elaborate traditional structures. But this safety came with costs that went far beyond the physical labor of construction. To sleep safely behind thick log walls meant accepting a different relationship with the land, a more static way of life that traded mobility for security. It meant living according to schedules and seasons determined by farming or trading rather than following the natural rhythms of animal herds and plant growth. It often meant adopting new religious practices, new social structures, new ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. These were not simple choices between traditional and modern ways of life, but complex negotiations involving safety, identity, autonomy, and community survival. A family might spend part of the year at a mission or trading post, taking advantage of solid shelter during tornado season, then return to mobile teepees during calmer months when they could resume hunting and traveling. Others might build earth lodges in protected valleys, creating permanent bases that combine traditional architectural techniques with strategic positioning designed to minimize tornado risk. These hybrid solutions reflected the creative ways that Great Plains communities adapted to changing circumstances while trying to maintain cultural continuity and survival strategies that had proven effective over generations. The Earth Lodge communities of the Pawnee and Mandan represented one such adaptation, semi-permanent structures that offered better storm protection than teepees while maintaining the agricultural flexibility necessary for survival in an unpredictable climate. Built partially underground with heavy timber frames and earth-covered roofs, these structures could withstand all but the most severe tornadoes while still allowing their inhabitants to relocate if changing conditions required it. The weather, in its democratic violence, revealed these choices and their consequences with stark clarity. When tornado winds began to blow, social hierarchies and cultural differences mattered less than the simple physics of shelter construction. A teepee, no matter how beautifully decorated or skillfully made, could not protect its inhabitants from a direct tornado hit. A log cabin, no matter how crude or hastily built, offered significantly better chances of survival. But the storms also revealed the limits of purely material solutions to the challenges of Great Plains life. The mission buildings might survive tornado strikes, but they could not survive the larger social and political storms that would eventually sweep away most of the frontier settlements and missionary outposts. The traditional knowledge systems that enabled mobile peoples to read weather signs and move to safety proved more durable than many of the permanent structures built by newcomers to the region. As decades passed, the most successful adaptations to Great Plains weather-combined elements from multiple traditions. Railroad towns learned to build storm cellars using native knowledge about earth-sheltered construction. Ranching families adopted traditional weather reading skills while maintaining European-style houses for daily life. Military posts incorporated traditional knowledge about seasonal weather patterns into their operational planning while relying on permanent fortifications for protection. The survivors of the Great Plains settlement period were those who learned to navigate between different systems of environmental knowledge, taking advantage of the strengths of each while understanding their limitations. They developed hybrid survival strategies that combined traditional knowledge with new technologies, mobility with security, individual preparation with community cooperation. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine yourself standing at a window of thick, wavy glass, watching a tornado approach across the prairie from a position of relative safety. The walls around you are solid and strong. The roof above your head has weathered many storms. You can observe the terrible beauty of the rotating column of air without fear for your immediate survival. But through that same window, you can also see the people who have no such shelter, families gathering their children and running for the creek bed, abandoning homes and possessions in the desperate hope that their knowledge of the land will keep them alive until morning. Their vulnerability is absolute, their courage is extraordinary, and their survival depends on wisdom that cannot be purchased or built, but must be earned through generations of careful attention to forces far greater than any human shelter. Both forms of safety have their place in the long story of how humans learned to live on the tornado-prone Great Plains. Both represent different ways of negotiating with the same fundamental challenge: how to find security in a landscape where the sky itself can become an enemy with almost no warning. The mission walls speak to the human desire for permanence, for the kind of security that can be built with tools and materials and maintained through careful construction. The traditional shelters speak to a different kind of security, the confidence that comes from intimate knowledge of environmental patterns, from social systems organized around mobility and mutual assistance, from survival strategies tested and refined over countless generations. Neither approach provided perfect safety. Both involved trade-offs between different kinds of risk and different definitions of security. The storms that swept across the Great Plains in the 19th century tested both strategies, revealing their strengths and exposing their limitations with the merciless clarity that only natural disasters can provide. The storms that shape these choices continue to sweep across the same landscapes today, following the same atmospheric patterns, bringing the same challenges to each new generation of people who choose to make their lives under the vast, uncertain sky of the Great Plains. They carry the same lessons about the relationship between human vulnerability and environmental knowledge, between material security and adaptive intelligence, between the safety of walls and the safety of wisdom. Modern meteorology and construction techniques have changed the terms of these ancient negotiations, but they have not eliminated the fundamental choices that tornado weather reveals. We still must decide whether to trust in permanent structures or maintain the mobility that enables escape. We still must balance individual security against community survival. We still must choose between the safety that can be built and the safety that must be learned. The wind continues to blow across the same prairies, carrying the same atmospheric pressures and the same potential for violence. The only constant is the need for each generation to find its own balance between resistance and adaptation, between security and flexibility, between the confidence that comes from solid walls and the confidence that comes from knowledge of when to abandon everything and run. As our gentle journey through time draws to its quiet close, and as sleep begins to beckon you toward its peaceful embrace, let us pause for a moment to consider how far we've traveled together through these forgotten corners of history. We began this evening under the vast sky of the Great Plains, imagining ourselves as young people learning to read the subtle language of clouds and wind. We felt the rough buffalo hide beneath our bodies, tasted the metallic tang of approaching storms, experienced the constant vigilance required to survive in a world where home could be scattered to the winds in minutes. We lived for a brief time in that space between alertness and acceptance that defined life for countless generations of plains peoples. We followed the life of Whirlwind Woman, watching as she grew from a sky-watching child into a keeper of weather wisdom, her story reminding us that survival in such an exposed landscape depended not on individual heroics, but on the patient accumulation and careful sharing of knowledge across generations. Through her eyes, we saw how human attention and wisdom could create islands of safety even in the most unpredictable environments. We drifted through the mysteries that still whisper to us from stone circles hidden in the grass, from caves marked by ancient fires, from the intersection of spiritual practice and meteorological expertise that allowed entire peoples to live in partnership with forces far greater than themselves. In those quiet mysteries, we glimpsed knowledge systems so sophisticated they integrated practical survival skills with ceremonial frameworks designed to preserve crucial wisdom across centuries. And we observed the subtle hierarchies and hard choices that tornado weather revealed. The differences between log walls and buffalo hide, between permanent shelter and mobile wisdom, between the safety that could be built and the safety that had to be earned through constant attention to the moods of an ever-changing sky. Throughout this journey, we've been accompanied by a simple truth that connects past and present. We all live under the same sky. The storms that challenged plains peoples in the 1840s follow the same atmospheric patterns that create severe weather today. The fundamental physics of tornado formation hasn't changed, nor has the basic human challenge of finding ways to live safely with forces much more powerful than ourselves. But perhaps what's most remarkable about the story we've shared tonight is not how different that historical world was from our own, but how much wisdom it contained that we can still learn from. The patient attention to atmospheric signs, the community cooperation in the face of shared danger, the acceptance that safety comes not from controlling nature, but from understanding it well enough to bend with its rhythms. These remain valuable insights for anyone who chooses to live in tornado-prone regions. When you wake tomorrow morning and step outside to check the weather, you'll be participating in a practice that stretches back thousands of years. That quick glance at the sky, that unconscious reading of wind direction and cloud formation, that subtle feeling in your bones that tells you a storm might be approaching. All of this connects you to Whirlwind Woman and countless others whose names we'll never know, but whose careful observations helped their people survive under the same vast, unpredictable sky. The young plains dweller we imagined at the beginning of our journey, rolling from their buffalo hide bed to taste the metallic air of an approaching storm, was engaged in the same fundamental practice that you engage in when you check your weather app or listen to forecasters describe pressure systems moving across the continent. The tools have changed dramatically, but the underlying human need to understand and prepare for weather remains constant. And those mysterious stone circles scattered across the prairie grass? They remind us that humans have always sought ways to create sacred relationships with the forces that shape our lives. Whether through ancient ceremonies we can only guess at or through modern meteorological science, we continue to seek understanding of atmospheric powers that remain, in many ways, as mysterious and unpredictable as they were centuries ago. The social contrasts we explored between those who slept safely behind thick walls and those who trusted their lives to weather wisdom and quick reflexes echo in our own time in the differences between those who can afford safe rooms and storm shelters and those who must depend on community warning systems and public shelters. The fundamental challenges of living with severe weather haven't disappeared. They've simply taken new forms. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, in a dwelling with walls that will almost certainly protect you from any weather that might approach, take a moment to appreciate not just your physical safety, but the long chain of human learning and adaptation that made such safety possible. Every weather forecast you receive, every building code that ensures structural integrity, every emergency warning system that gives you time to take shelter, all of these represent accumulated wisdom from thousands of people who learn to read the sky's moods and share that knowledge with their communities. The wind that whispers outside your window tonight carries echoes of all the winds that have blown across these landscapes throughout human history. In its voice, if you listen carefully, you might hear the same messages that taught generations of weather readers when to seek shelter, when to move their families to safety, when to trust in their knowledge, and when to simply endure whatever the sky might bring. Somewhere in the darkness beyond your walls, the grass is still bending in patterns shaped by pressure systems and temperature gradients that follow laws as old as the atmosphere itself. The same stars that guided plains travelers to safe camping spots shine down on the sleeping prairie. The same moon that allowed night moves to safer ground continues its patient journey across the sky. In this moment of quiet transition between waking and sleep, between our shared historical journey and your personal rest, you are connected to all the humans who have ever lain down to sleep under uncertain skies, trusting that their wisdom and preparation would be enough to see them safely through to morning. You carry their legacy of careful attention, community cooperation, and respectful relationship with forces beyond human control. The storms they learned to survive still build on western horizons. The knowledge they developed still protects human communities. The sky they watch so carefully still arches overhead, vast and powerful and eternal, sheltering our small human stories beneath its limitless expanse. Rest now, knowing that you sleep safely under the same sky that has watched over human dreams for countless generations. Let the wind outside your window sing you gently towards sleep with the same soft prairie lullaby that has eased people into rest for as long as humans have made their homes beneath the great dome of the sky. The storms will come and go as they always have. The grass will bend and straighten with each passing wind. The horizon will continue its ancient dialogue with the clouds. And tomorrow when you wake, you'll step outside into the same endless conversation between earth and sky that has shaped human life on the Great Plains since people first learned to listen to the weather's quiet warnings. Sleep well, fellow traveler. The sky keeps its patient watch, and morning will come with its own gentle weather, its own possibilities, its own invitation to step outside and read the signs that connect us all to the long, unbroken story of human beings learning to live safely under forces far greater than themselves. In the soft darkness beyond your walls, the wind carries the memory of every storm that has passed and the promise of every calm morning yet to come. Rest now. The sky remembers everything and keeps us all safe in its vast, eternal embrace. I'm grateful you spent this time with me tonight. I upload soft, slow history stories nearly every day, so there's always another waiting for you. Tap subscribe if you'd like to keep these gentle journeys close. Rest easy, friend.